I'm going to show you 2 easy ways to make your mixes sound fat and professional.
Don't keep me waiting fire.
So that's my remake of Don't Keep Me Waiting by Side Piece. You probably know them from their track with Diplo, On My Mind. But anyway, I think all of their tracks are a great example of how to make your mixes sound really big and punchy. And these concepts can really apply to all genres of music. So the first thing is to not use a lot of layers, and the second thing is to look at your mix in 3 dimensions. But I'll explain that later. Let's talk about the first thing. People think that adding a ton of new layers and new sounds to their track will make the mix sound big, but actually ends up doing the opposite. All of those layers are going to compete for the same frequencies, which actually makes the mix end up sounding muddy. I'll give you an example. Say I want to add a layer to this lead. I'll try to add this sound on top of it. So I'll bring up an EQ so you can see what's going on, but look at the low mid frequencies before and after I add the layer in. There ends up being a pretty big boost to those low mids around like 300 hertz, which may not sound like a big deal now, but when you're trying to mix the full track later, that's going to make the mix sound muddier. And a lot of times I see producers doing this with like 8 different layers. It can be good to layer sounds, but at a certain point, all the frequencies are just clashing where it makes it hard to mix everything together. In the drop of this side piece track, all they have is that one lead layer, which you just heard. Then they have the bass. Then the drums. And of course the vocals.
Don't keep me waiting fire.
And what they've done by keeping the number of layers in the mix so low is create pockets where each thing can sit in the mix. You can see the kick is obviously taking up the low end. Then it's easy to add in a clap that's taking up like the high mids. And an open hat that just takes up the highs. Then you obviously have the bass taking up the low end too, while the lead takes up the mids and the highs. When everything's in its own little space, you can focus on making each layer sound as professional as possible. And nothing's fighting with each other, so you can make the whole mix sound really cohesive. The second way to make your mixes sound better is to think of them in 3 dimensions. So we already placed everything in the frequency spectrum. We can look at that as 2 dimensions. Everything there is being plotted by volume and frequency. But if we add time as a 3rd variable, we can start to think of our mixes in 3 dimensions. You all already do this to some extent. Let's take an oscilloscope, which is just a fancy word for something that plugins like Volume Shaper do, which is show the volume of a sound over time. You can see in the window that the kick is taking up the first half of every quarter note, and that's why we sidechain basses to the kick drum. When you add the kick and bass together, the low end is balanced over time. So when you're mixing a track, don't just think about how the volume is changing over time, think about how the whole frequency spectrum is changing over time. So in this track, the vocal comes in at certain points. And if you look at what frequencies the vocal is taking up,
Don't keep me waiting fire.
and if you compare that to what frequencies the lead synth is taking up, you'll notice they're taking up similar frequencies. If you're looking at the mix from a 3-dimensional perspective, you might decide to cut out the lead sound early, right when the vocal comes in. I think that sounds a lot cleaner than leaving the lead in there underneath the vocal. The vocal is already drowning out the lead, so the listener won't really even notice if you take that lead out when the vocal comes in. Another example of this with a different track would be if you wanted to add some stab sounds in between the lead melody. So if you're looking at this melody from a time perspective, you'll notice there's some gaps in time where nothing is really playing in the lead, so that leaves room for something else to fill that void. So in this case, I'll add some brass stab sounds in there. So even though the stabs and the lead sound are taking up a lot of the frequency spectrum, they're not fighting with each other because they're not happening at the same time. So the mix still sounds pretty clean. So if you can not only focus on where you're placing layers in the frequency spectrum, but also focus on where you're placing them in time, it can help your mixes sound huge. And if you want to dive deeper into that side piece remix I've made, I've packaged up the drum samples, mix stems, presets, project file, and processing all in one download on my website. Thank you guys for watching. Peace.
Don't keep me waiting, Via.